Welcome to Walpole Five-0. I'm Chief John Carmichael. Today is September 19th, 2017. And as usual, before we get into the log, a few things to mention. I have the honor of being invited to meet with Attorney General Jeff Sessions this week from the U.S. Attorney's Office. He is the U.S. Attorney General, and excited to go in there and talk about some of the issues that we're facing. I think part of it is going to be with the partnership between federal, state, and local police departments, but also going to bring up some of the issues with marijuana, and especially some of the more significant issues like the diversion of marijuana getting into the hands of our youth, as well as trafficking across state lines and other issues such as drug driving, which will hopefully also come up. But I look forward to participating. It's going to be like a roundtable discussion, so it's going to be important, I think, because there is a trickle-down effect. Whether we think, the big picture of drugs, Massachusetts has now become a state where we are more of a source location for, especially, when we talk about drugs such as heroin and fentanyl. So, these drugs are much more pure nowadays. The organizational crime part of it is much more structured here in Massachusetts now. So when we have that, there is a trickle-down effect into local communities like Walpole, and that is evident in all of the overdoses that we've had and the issues and incidents that we have involving this drug. So it'll be a great discussion. I really look forward to it in representing Walpole at that meeting. On a crash update, I did report a while back we had a crash that actually involved marijuana impairment, where an individual was drag racing with another individual on Diamond Street, which is a very small street where Blessed Sacrament Church is. And as these two were drag racing down Diamond Street, one of them lost control, went off the road, struck a pedestrian who was walking with two small children. Luckily, that pedestrian didn't get the brunt of that crash, but still was injured as a result. And the individual then sideswiped and struck a utility pole and split that pole right in half. The pole ended up out in the middle of the street. Officer Foley, who was our crash reconstructionist, he does all of the crash analysis and reconstruction of serious and fatal crashes that we have here in Walpole. He's very good at it. He is what's called ACTA certified, and he's testified as an expert, and he's trained other police officers in this across Massachusetts. So Officer Foley, very well versed in crash reconstruction. In his analysis, he came up with that vehicle traveling at a rate of speed of 76 miles per hour when it struck the pole. And this poor pedestrian was just clipped in that crash, but that could have been much worse consequences than what we had. That person, we did take out charges for operating to endanger and operating under the influence of marijuana, as well as a litany of other charges. And it appears that the district attorney's office wants to indict this case, so we're hoping that that happens and going forward. Important to note that this person also was under the age of 21, and while we have legalized marijuana in Massachusetts, possession and use of that, if you're under 21, is still against the law. Want to mention because I've been fielding a lot of phone calls today and media issues. Today, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court came out with their decision on the Gerhardt case, which is Commonwealth versus Gerhardt. And most of these calls have been of how this case is going to affect Massachusetts. Essentially what it's about is it asks a series of questions about how relevant standard field sobriety testing is in Massachusetts for marijuana. And as we know, when standard field sobriety testing mostly focused on alcohol, and when there are certain when there's certain responses and outcomes of a field sobriety test when it has to do with alcohol, it correlates, those certain things that correlate in those field sobriety tests that would make somebody equivalent to, say, 0.08 breath alcohol content. The problem is in Massachusetts and across the country, there was no real correlation shown scientifically that standard field sobriety testing, the same way we use for alcohol, is the same for marijuana, and that these failure of these tests would correlate with impairment of marijuana. So that was really what they looked at. They said no, that officers cannot testify to these field sobriety tests and give an opinion at the end of that field sobriety test. But the problem is, well, not the problem, but really what police officers still have to depend on is the whole circumstances involved in the stop. What was the original stop for? Did they fail to stop for a stop sign or a red light? Once the officer stops at, what are their observations? Do they smell marijuana? Is the person's eyes glassy and bloodshot? Are they very slow in reacting and how they respond to the officer? How are they as far as determining time, and is there any time lapse? There's certain things the officer can use roadside, but they're also taking into consideration that person's behavior, their appearance, their demeanor, and other things that the officer might pick up on. So the officers can still testify as a layperson in court, just like anybody else could, as far as trying to determine if somebody is high. So it does hamper our ability to do our job, but it's not a game changer. It's not to the point where we can't still do what we need to do out there. And at the end of the day, a police officer's job, they're obligated to keep the road safe, keep our community safe, and establish that probable cause to believe that the person could be impaired and support that in their observations. And as such, making sure that people don't continue to drive away when they're impaired and cause jeopardy or cause any harm to our community. So not the best case that went our way, but it's a case that where there is still some ability for us to do our job. So getting into the log on September 12th, protective custody, report of a disoriented individual. They were walking on 1A, stumbling into traffic. People were calling. Officer Foley discovered an individual walking along the roadway. He was extremely intoxicated. Officer Foley placed them into protective custody. They were from Dudley, Massachusetts, which I'm not really sure where that is, but it's not near here. So I don't know how that individual ended up here in Walpole, but he did. Sometimes it said vortex type of thing and just brought him here somehow. But anyways, that individual was placed in protective custody. Hit and run, motor vehicle crash. Officer Foley, he covered a two-car crash on Route 1 at High Plain Street. The second vehicle fled. Officers were unable to locate that second vehicle. I bring the hit and runs up because there's an increase in those. We're seeing like maybe 20% of our crashes are involving hit and run. So people just are not stopping. And that's very concerning. And I think part of that, I would attribute that to maybe the high rates of insurance and that type of thing. And that's why people aren't stopping. But they're afraid of the surcharge. But if you ever witness some of these things, we always ask the public to try and get a registration plate, type of vehicle, color of vehicle, direction of flight, so that we can kind of deal with these situations here. We did have several other crashes during the week, Maine and Bullard in that area. Also a dangerous stretch of road there because the state has been talking about putting lights there, but they have not done that. So several crashes this week were reported in that intersection as well. Officers responded to a road rage incident. This was on Route 1 North. It was near the intersection of Union Street. This was apparently a road rage incident that was occurring for some time down Route 1, finally causing one of the victims to call the police, got Walpole PD and Norwood PD. We were unable to locate that vehicle, but we did look for it. Officer Foley responded to that. So it was like the Officer Foley report this week. He's everywhere. Larceny from a motor vehicle. A resident from East Walpole reported that somebody entered their motor vehicle during the night. They entered through an open window and they stole a GPS system and cash and some loose change that was inside of that motor vehicle. As always, we always mention, this, safeguard property, take the right precautions to prevent people from doing this. Some people may say, well, it's better off to leave the vehicle unsecure and then people won't smash my window and break in, which is a good argument, but 99% of the time the car breaks that we have involve an open door or an open window where people, crime of opportunity, where you see this object and they just go take it. We do have the B&E once in a while where the windows are smashed, but that's an exception. Most of the time they're unsecured doors or windows. Protective custody, report of an intoxicated person. This was at the MBTA station on West Street. Officers responded. It wasn't Officer Foley this time. This was Officer Dolan. And he found an individual from Norwood who was highly intoxicated, and the officer placed that individual into protective custody. Officer Dolan on that one. Shoplifting, larceny over. Walmart reported a shoplifter, an individual from Boston. They were arrested and they were in possession of over $1,500 worth of merchandise. Now, this is one of those cases where, when police officers go to shoplifting calls, and obviously we have a mall, we have Kohl's, we have Walmart, we have a lot of large type stores where they may be subjected to high amounts of shoplifting. And the officers always use very good discretion. How much was the stuff that they stole? What is their history? Have they done this before? Many times are you dealing with a chain of people who are going around and shoplifting at multiple locations? Or it might just be the amounts, and in this case, like I said, $1,500 worth, and being caught stealing that, the officer chose to arrest in this case. And it was Officer Foley again. So great job by Officer Foley this week. Yeah. MVP. So that's kind of how they do their discretion with it. Motor vehicle breaking and entering. We got a call from Norfolk PD. There was 2 people that were attempting to break into a vehicle. This was over the in Norfolk on the Summer Street at the town line. So Officer Wilmot and Powers went down there. They checked along with Norfolk, and they were unable to locate this person or anyone attempting to break in. So this is it's consistent with what we've been seeing, a couple of car breaks here and there. So nothing found on this one though. Noise complaint. Caller reported noise coming from the Walpole Mall. Officer Powers he spoke to a crew behind there. There was damage to a light pole, and apparently that was quickly fixed. There's something that I don't know. They shouldn't be doing that at night in the first place. That's something I think they could fix during the day. And as a result, that message was sent, and the people who live in the mall would appreciate that that noise not be taking place at night like that. Parking complaint. This was in the area of John Turco Drive. Officer Murphy only located 1 vehicle. He spoke to the owner about it in that case. Violation of a 209A. A 209A is a restraining order. This individual came to Walpole, violated a restraining order. The officers responded. The individual is gone on arrival. Officer Doherty did a great job on scene, taking the report, assisting the victims, and also following up with this. And eventually he located the individual in Sharon, located his motor vehicle. And when he located his motor vehicle, that individual would not answer the door. Officer Doherty continued to follow up. He was being relentless. He followed up with the clerk magistrate and applied for a warrant. He got the warrant, went back, joined with other Walpole police officers, and they located that individual and arrested him for the warrant and violating the 209A. So I appreciate Officer Doherty's extra effort there in making sure that he took this seriously and ended up arresting that person. Suspicious person, this is on Route 1, and I don't have all the details. It was more of a log entry, but the individual was observed wearing an ankle monitoring bracelet, which would typically be issued through probation in the courts. But it doesn't say here what exactly they were doing to be suspicious. They did locate that individual at the Best Western in Sharon, and they checked him out, and obviously had some history, but nothing pending or that was taking place at the time the officers dealt with them. Malicious destruction, and I'm not sure if this is malicious or not, or if this was just somebody that went off the road. But I just dealt with this situation. Spring Valley at Lewis Ave. Many of the residents down there were complaining because there was no stop sign on Spring Valley at Lewis Ave. So basically people were coming off of 1A and using that as a cut through and just not yielding into Lewis Ave and not stopping, and therefore causing a public safety hazard. Well, we went through the Board of Selectmen, requested some amendments to our traffic regulations, and yes, we have to do this just to put in a stop sign. And the board voted to put in the stop sign. The DPW and Drew Hand and those guys went right down immediately and put the sign up, and wasn't up for a day, and somebody went off the road and struck the sign and knocked it over. So they immediately worked on that to put it back up. But I don't know. So anyways, that sign is back up, and usually we'll start to monitor that after a couple of weeks so people get used to stopping there. Be on the lookout. So this was from Norwood PD. It was a stolen vehicle from the Dunkin' Donuts on Manhattan Street, and this vehicle fled towards Walpole. It was a 2011 black Mercedes, and the registration number was 9888LE, and that was that vehicle that was stolen. We did not find that at the time. Want to thank all of our officers who participated in Main Street Live. The festivities went on without any problems. The town, Liz Dennehy, and as well as some of the people that work for the Downtown Business Association, Donnell Murphy, did a great job organizing this, and the police went over and helped out with traffic and community policing activities. So it seems like it was a good turnout and a good thing for Walpole. Arrest, individual was arrested on an outstanding warrant. It turns out that this was for an OUI, alcohol, that occurred in Foxborough. The officers placed that individual under arrest. This is where some of these things can turn into a nightmare for us as far as custodies, because we notified this individual had no bail on this warrant because it was a default warrant. The individual was, we were going to try and get him into the Dedham House of Correction, and doing that, there was a medical issue that came up, so we had to transport the individual to the hospital and oversee that person all weekend, and even until today, Monday and Tuesday, where this individual is still technically in custody, but also a patient in the hospital. So tough situation, but we own them 24 hours a day until they can be arraigned at court. Parking issues, the Apple Harvest Fair, there was some people complaining about the parking. We went over there and took some actions as far as setting up, blocking one street and making a one-way. Road rage incident, community policing. Officer Thayer also went over to the Apple Harvest Fair and made a visual appearance and gave out some of the phone cars, Walpole Police phone cars, and did some community policing activities. Always appreciate that. Road rage, be on the lookout from Norwood PD. There was another road rage incident on Route 1. We again checked the area, and we didn't actually see that vehicle come into Walpole down Route 1, so it could have turned off somewhere. A well-being check, Officer Foley did a well-being check on two youths. This was in the area of, towards the center of town. They were apparently playing with kitchen knives. Obviously not the safest toy to be using, and Officer Foley investigated, and he was able to determine the parties involved and took care of that situation. Crash on Main at Willett Street. Again, as I mentioned, Main and Bullard, Main and Willett, obviously a dangerous intersection. Officer Doherty covered a crash here. Luckily, none of those had injuries or anything. So, ambulance. Reported East Walpole, woman choking. Officers went down there and assisted the ambulance on that call. Obviously, those were always serious medical emergencies, very worrisome for families or anybody else around it, and the officers went down there to assist. Walpole Police Department does respond to all medical emergencies, all ambulance calls. many times were already out on the street, and as first responders, they can get there and start to render aid and assist in securing that scene for the fire department. The officers in the fire department work very closely together, and they do a great job dealing with all the situations that we have. So it's good teamwork. Individual was a warrant arrest. Individual was arrested on a warrant. I don't have the details about what that warrant was, but Officer Doherty, Haber, and Foley Kevlich were involved in that. And as I've mentioned before, like a lot of times we get a warrant dump every week. So what that is the courts give us all of the warrants that are active in the computer that are all Walpole warrants or people that may show an address in Walpole. And we do, on occasion, we'll go out and just do warrant sweeps and attempt to locate individuals as ordered by the court to locate and bring that person before the court. Summons, a couple of summonses for shoplifting. As I mentioned earlier, the $1,500 larceny, which resulted in an arrest. These two here, two different locations on Route 1. Officer Slavin and Moriarty summons one individual in for shoplifting, and then Officer Slavin and Moriarty again, a short time later, responded to a second location, and a female was summoned for shoplifting there. A marijuana incident. Officer Haber stopped an individual from Boston. They had blue lights on the front of their vehicle, which you cannot have unless you're a police vehicle. During the stop, an open container of marijuana was turned over, and this individual, eventually what happened is as Officer Haber was having conversation with this person, he started to take note and make some observations about some things in the vehicle and that were consistent with the distribution of marijuana, not so much the possession of marijuana, and dealt with a lot of unburnt marijuana. And as a result, Officer Haber arrested this individual for possession with intent to distribute the drug of marijuana. And as I've mentioned before, there was some open containers as well, which is now a civil $500 fine. But there was other evidence of distribution of marijuana. And as I've said before, even we've legalized that drug, but we have not legalized the sale of it. So you still can't sell marijuana in Massachusetts unless you're issued a Cannabis Control Commission registration or through DPH under the medical marijuana program. Another arrest, an arrest by Officer Dolan for assault and battery. This was in West Walpole. Shortly after that, officers responded to a report of an overdose in a restaurant, and the call came to 911 for an individual that was overdosing. Officers responded. Officer Doherty was the first one on scene. He administered Narcan or naloxone to the victim. The victim immediately began to hit the Narcan away and actually pushed it into his nose cavity. And it's unusual because when before we started administering nasal naloxone or nasal Narcan, the paramedics, the fire department would show up, the paramedics would arrive, and they would do the injectable Narcan. And what we used to see is people would wake up very quickly and violently, and many times they had to be subdued and held down because they just came out of this, and it's a very traumatic situation. So with the nasal Narcan, most of the time people come out of it much slower, so there's not that that struggle type of situation that's occurring. So, but in this case, this individual came out of it a little quicker than usual. So in any event, it was a great job by Officer Doherty, the fire department, and saved this individual from an overdose. An arrest, this was occurred in East Walpole, came through third-party call. There was a witness intimidation involved as well as assault and battery, and that arrest took place by Officer Haber. Threatening. 3 youths, they were threatened with a knife by a 15-year-old. Sergeant Hazeldine went down there and she took a report on this, and we'll deal with that with the parents in that case. And breaking and entering, forced entry, this occurred on East Street. Officers responded to a break-in and entering at 470 East Street. It was an abandoned house. Detective Kelleher responded out. He was called out to the scene. He processed the scene for any evidentiary value. And Officer Bieberman is the reporting officer on that. So that's it for today, September 19th, 2017. And I'm Chief John Carmichael. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you next time on Walpole 5-0.